St. Mark doesn't give the disciples much of a break, does he? And today's gospel is a very good example of that. Jesus has taught the disciples about his upcoming suffering, death, and resurrection. And Mark tells us that they just don't understand what Jesus was saying to them. They seem to want to change the subject. And frankly, that's probably something that we all would want to do at that point. After their arrival in Capernaum, Jesus asked what they were arguing about on the way. And they are reduced to silence. Their crassness and ambition are exposed as they admit to arguing about who among them is the greatest. The disciples may not have understood what Jesus meant about his rejection, suffering, and death, but instead of discussing among themselves what his rising from the dead might mean, or what they would do if Jesus were treated the way he was predicted, instead of that, they talk about their future prospects. Could they have been more insensitive about what they had just been taught? Mark never smooths out the rough edges of the disciples. He presents them just as they were, people of their time. With all the other Jews of the time, they were hoping for the arrival of the Messiah to overthrow their enemies and bring Israel back to greatness. Last week, we heard Peter proclaim Jesus as the Messiah. The disciples following Jesus to Jerusalem, they believed that they were walking side by side with the Christ. And they were right. But they were very wrong about what kind of Messiah Jesus was. They saw glory up ahead of them, and they were arguing about the place settings at their table. They needed to be taught that the power that Jesus will bring as Messiah is going to take the shape of service. God's love for us will be shown in power, but as a power that is redefined as service to the least. I was wondering if the leaders of the early first century church for whom Mark was writing, I was wondering if they were already claiming rank and privilege. So maybe he wrote that piece of the gospel to remind them what Jesus taught about their responsibility, that they were supposed to be the least of all and the servant of all. That's a sobering reminder, not only to the church's hierarchy, but it also addresses other people who are in charge, diocesan officials, heads of liturgy committees, pastoral council, finance committees, teachers. Power easily goes to our heads. We need regular reminders that we are servants, whether we wear vestments or business suits or titles on our doors or desks or stand in front of a class of unformed minds. When you come right down to it, we may seem to have power, but we are really never in control, no matter what our rank or privileged position. It doesn't take long for us to realize that our best-made plans don't always work out. The power to plan and design our futures, very shaky indeed. The disciples seeking position of authority and recognition will soon be frustrated in those plans. And Jesus is instructing them that they need to shift their attention someplace else, to an investment in the future that will not fail them. They need to follow their master and do what it was that he did. use any authority that they might receive to be in service to others. If the disciples are to gain lasting dignity, then they must be willing to be the servants to all. And still more, instead of seeking out and serving the high-placed and the important folks of our society and church, the true disciple is to seek out the company of the poor in this world, the insignificant, the children. You know, children in Jesus' time, they had no rank, they had no rights, no privileges. They were property of their fathers. And because of that, they were exceedingly vulnerable. So when Jesus says, "Welcome the child into your lives," we must accept being vulnerable. We must accept being dependent on God. The true disciple is to be just like that. What we know from the teachings of Jesus is that the least will discover the presence of Jesus himself. And as we celebrate the true presence of Jesus in today's Eucharist, maybe we should consider where in the world else we might discover the true presence. And we could begin looking in the direction that he points to today, to the least. The gospel, as always, is so contradictory, so opposite to our ideals and values. Sometimes it seems so impractical. For example, think about that term, first come, first served. That's an axiom that the whole world lives by. Heaven help the person who jumps ahead of others in the supermarket line, or at the buffet, or on a movie line. Hey, first come, first serve, we yell at them. But in God's kingdom, Jesus tells us to make a deliberate choice to serve others and renounce any idea of being the first online. And that doesn't make any sense. That is, if we rely on our own logic. But it's always that contrary gospel. Jesus isn't inviting us to a logic classroom. He's giving us a schooling in discipleship. He urges us to believe and accept the mystery of God's kingdom shown to us in the fullness of Jesus. After all, in Jesus, that's exactly what God did, huh? He became a servant. God was willing to leave behind all the divine splendor and take up the limitations of our human condition all the way to death on a cross. If we feel stuck in a place or an attitude or a spiritual condition, we are reminded that with Jesus, we can leave that place of stuckness and go in the direction of becoming fuller and more complete disciples. Jesus and his disciples began a journey. We're not there yet. We're not the perfect disciples who left everything and followed Jesus. Not the self-sacrificing ones who left behind prestige and seek to serve the least. But rather than being disheartened at our incompleteness, we can really take heart. We may not be there yet, but we are in the process of becoming the disciples that Jesus has called us to be. We have all begun our journey. And we are not struggling to get there on our own because, as St. Mark reminds us, we have Jesus traveling with us on this journey. The Eucharist today is but another moment on the journey towards us being disciples. Here we hear the grace-filled word and receive the meal that helps us take the next steps toward being disciples that Jesus had in mind. Those who should be the least of all and the servants of all.